In this video, we're going to look at a challenging passage of Scripture. Personally, I find this passage of Scripture to be challenging because there are a lot of pieces that need to be understood. So it requires a lot more leaning in and trying to pursue and pursuing God's heart rather than carnal understanding. The passage of Scripture that we're going to look at is in 1 Corinthians chapter 11. Now, we know that the Scriptures were not written in chapters. So we're going to go ahead and look at what Paul was talking about prior to this chapter. And what Paul was talking about are our rights. And he was talking about them within the context of don't exercise your rights. Care more about other people than you do about your own rights. If your rights are going to destroy a brother or sister, don't exercise those rights. And he finishes it up by saying, so whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, do it all for the glory of God. Do not cause anyone to stumble, whether Jews, Greeks, or the church of God, even as I try to please everyone in every way. For I'm not seeking my own good, but the good of many, so that they may be saved. Then the very next chapter, he starts out by saying, follow my example as I follow the example of Christ. And Christ is a perfect example of offering himself for the benefit of others. And that's exactly what we're supposed to be doing. We're supposed to be mimicking his example. Now he's going to go on to talk about a sort of pattern of what he's just said. Follow my example as I follow the example of Christ. Let me tell you what this does not mean. It does not mean that if you've discerned someone to not be a shepherd of God, and they're going around calling themselves apostle and prophet, as people do in counterfeit Christianity, you should not follow their example. He says, follow my example as I follow the example of Christ. It also does not say, worship Paul. And we know that the law says, worship God only. But he is going to describe a sort of chain of command in a way. I praise you for remembering me in everything and for holding to the traditions just as I pass them on to you. But I want you to realize that the head of every man is Christ. The head of every man is Christ, and the head of the woman is man. And the other translation is, or of the wife is her husband, which makes a little bit more sense because not every woman has a man. He is specifically talking about marriage. And the translators have a very bad habit of selecting translations that don't make sense with the rest of Scripture, such as a woman should go ask her husband at home and stay quiet in the church. That doesn't make any sense. Not all women have a husband at home. The other option in the translation is wife. And in the OJB version, we realize that wives had been blurting out in the church over their husbands. Oh, that makes a little bit more sense because it doesn't create disorder for a woman to speak in church, but it does create disorder for a wife to be blurting out over her husband. Don't assume that because someone has gone to school and been given some credentials that they have any common sense or wisdom whatsoever. But I want you to realize that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of the wife is the husband, and the head of Christ is God. Now, let's think for a moment, what is the relationship between Christ and God? God the Father, that is. Jesus submitted to the Father, and the Father cared for Jesus. And the word says that the woman submits to the husband, the wife submits to the husband, and the husband also submits to the wife. So we need to understand some things before we continue on. We need to understand the difference between submission, worship, and authority. The head may direct, but it can't direct without the body. And the word states it. The word says worship God only. So Paul is not saying to worship men or husbands. When we talk about authority, we're talking about responsibility. We're talking about a role in which that person has been given trust and responsibility by God. And if they misuse that trust and responsibility by God, and I'm really going to emphasize this with you because there are people coming into the administration in the United States in January, there are people who are proponents of Project 2025 who believe in definitions of a husband ruling over his wife that are not biblical. Yes, God said that man was going to rule over the woman, and then he gave specific instructions as to the responsibilities of men, of husbands. He did not give carte blanche permission to anyone in the responsibilities we've been given to mistreat. So a mother who has been given the trust of caring for her children, does she get to smack her kids around and mistreat them because God gave her that trust, that responsibility? No. He's made it very clear how you're to take care of your kids. He's made it very clear that you don't frustrate your children, that you mentor them, that you raise them to Him, that you understand that all of the roles and trusts that you've been given have been given to you in obligation first to Him. The concept of submission means that we are committed to the other person. And when you're committed to someone, you submit yourself to caring about how they feel and caring about what their thoughts are. Does that mean you worship them? Because this gets conflated in counterfeit Christianity. What people think is, I'm supposed to submit myself to my husband, therefore I do everything he says, even when I know he's wrong. There are a lot of women, especially pastors' wives, because that's an identity for them, who worship their husbands, even when they know their husband is wrong. The word also says to submit yourself to the authorities. Now, if the authorities say to take something that is the mark of the beast, for example, which we know is actually in your heart, it's not something external, but if the authorities are forcing you to believe something that you know is not true, forcing you to do something that is against God's law, are you going to submit yourself to the authorities and say, well, God told me to do it? You going to do that? Well, then you have to use common sense in every situation, don't you? The word does not say worship the authorities. The word does not say that the authorities are God, and it doesn't say that about your spouses either. So there is a difference between submission and worship. There is a difference between authority and blank check permission to do whatever you want. So while the head directs and has been given authority, a trust to lead, the body is responsible for discerning whether that's correct leadership. The body also has been given authority over their own head. The woman has been given authority over her head. Discipline, must have discipline over her head. This is going to be important as we go on in the passage. I praise you for remembering me in everything and holding to the traditions just as I pass them on to you. But I want you to realize that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of the woman is man, and the head of Christ is God. Again, the correct translation here is, I want you to realize that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of every wife is the husband. And the implication there, guys, is that the body of every husband is his wife. You're not going to get very far without a body. Turns out that body has a lot of functions. Every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head. But every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head. It is the same as having her head shaved. For if a woman does not cover her head, she might as well have her hair cut off. But if it's a disgrace for a woman to have her hair cut off or her head shaved, then she should cover her head. This is not the correct translation. I'm going to show you, but let's keep reading. A man ought not to cover his head. Let me tell you what Paul is addressing here. He's addressing whether men are supposed to have long hair and women have short hair. That's what he's addressing. Don't make it more complicated than it actually is, or we would see in the law that there was a command to cover your head with some object. And God would explain why that's important. Now in verse 7, there's a little footnote of the actual correct translation. Every man who prays or prophesies with long hair dishonors his head, but every woman who prays or prophesies with no covering of hair dishonors her head. It's kind of like when Paul says there's certain clothes for women and certain clothes for men, and men should not be wearing a woman's garment, and women should not be wearing men's garments. Every woman who prays or prophesies with no covering of hair dishonors her head. She's just like one of the shorn women. If a woman has no covering, let her be for now with short hair. Okay, the covering has already been defined of hair, not of a scarf, not of a wig, not of a shawl or a veil. And yet many of the interpretations have added that to the scroll. If a woman has no covering, let her be for now with short hair. But since it is a disgrace for a woman to have her hair shorn or shaved, she should grow it again. Do you hear that he's made it very clear of what he's talking about? He's talking about hair. A man ought not to have long hair. That's the actual translation. And they put it in a footnote, secondary to the lie that they are putting out there. For man did not come from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for woman, but woman for man. It is for this reason that a woman ought to have authority over her own head. Okay, in some translations it says discipline over her own head. In some translations it says have a sign of authority on her. In all of those translations, it is clear that she has a role and responsibility over her own head. Is that what you see in Counterfeit Christianity? Because that's not what I saw when I was there. What I saw were pastors' wives looking cute and shutting up and deferring over their covenant to their pastor husband. That's what I saw. I saw that they don't feel any responsibility because they've believed this lie that they are not responsible for their own head, that they are not responsible for discerning, that they are not responsible for going back to God and understanding what their responsibilities are as a wife. The word talks about how do you know that if an unbelieving spouse is willing to stay with you, then you should stay married. And goes on to say, how do you know, wife, if you will save your husband? So does scripture mean to tell me that wife should allow the unbelieving spouse to lead her when they don't even believe? Now, I'm not saying that a wife is not supposed to submit herself to the unbelieving spouse. You submit yourself. You care about their thoughts. You care about their feelings. Otherwise, you have no relationship. What you don't do is hand over your responsibility in the covenant to anybody. We're going to camp out on verse 10 a little bit, but I want to finish up the context just in case there's anything in the context that we should know as we're discerning this. So starting from verse 10, it is for this reason that a woman ought to have authority over her own head, or discipline, or power, a sign of power, because of the angels. Nevertheless, in the Lord, woman is not independent of man, nor is man independent of woman. So that's something that's important in this context, because he's not saying that men get to rule ruthlessly over their wives. He's not saying that men don't need, that husbands don't need their wives. Neither is independent of the other. They're one, which is the reason why they need to submit to one another and care about their thoughts and feelings and what they're receiving from God. For as woman came from man, so also man is born of woman, but everything comes from God. Now, let me ask you something. So, a mother who has a son, does this mean because she's a woman, her son is not supposed to submit to her and be taught by her? As, people like to misinterpret the Bible. No, a man can't be taught by a woman, right? Never mind Priscilla. Never mind Huldah. Never mind Deborah. Submission is not worship. Authority means you've been given a trust, and that trust has been given to you by God, so he is the first one you are responsible to. In order for you to understand how to live out the trust he's given you, you have to submit to him first. And in the case with God, you not only submit to him, but you also worship him. And so every role that you're in, whether it be a parent or a spouse or a child, you always submit to God first, and then you'll be able to understand how to submit to those you are required to submit yourself to. which is everybody you're in a relationship with, you submit. As a child, you submit in obedience to your parents. As a spouse, submitting to your other spouse, you submit to one another so that you can come together to know how to manage your household. So what does this mean with regard to being the head or the body? What it means is that a wife should respect her husband's leadership, but a wife is also able to disagree with her husband's leadership if she does not believe that it is correct in God. For this reason, this is why I have such strong opinions about what I saw in counterfeit Christianity, in pastors' wives or in other wives, thinking that they were not responsible for discerning, because if you're submitted to God first and worshiping God alone, you're not going to hand over or abdicate control over your covenant, because you're going to be moved by God to live in your covenant, to live in the role that he gave you, to know how to say when things are not correct. But the problem is that these women have set their husbands up as idols, and the husbands have set themselves up as idols. They don't respect their wives. Some of them feel overburdened by the responsibility of being a leader and their wife not doing anything and just deferring to them all the time. That is a lot of responsibility to put on a person, and it's a lot of responsibility to remove from oneself. It is lazy and wicked. On both sides, it is very wicked. If you're living this out correctly, by God's Spirit, you're actually going to discover the reason why God set up a man and a woman, a husband and a wife, in this way. Because no one who goes up in the first resurrection is going to marry in the next age or be given in marriage. The purpose of this relationship is to help you to understand how Jesus leads and submits, not worships. He also submits himself to us. Does he not care about how we feel and what we think? Does he not minister with us and have a mutual relationship with us? Yes, he's been placed in a position of authority over us, and yet he helped us to understand that in the kingdom of heaven, anyone who's going to be in a higher position needs to serve, needs to lower themselves according to the standards of this world. So the devil's trying to reinterpret what God has established to their own gain. Don't even have the sense to understand that they are in both positions. If you're the wife of Jesus, does that mean that he's ruling over you ruthlessly? How does Jesus serve his church? How does he operate as the head? How is he leading? Is he a dictator? Is he Machiavelli? Or does he serve his church the same way that he did when he was here? Through leadership, yes, but through service. That's what's required of you, husbands. Sanctify your wife with the word. These are the things that the word says. Care about her. Present her as pure and righteous to God. How can a husband or a wife, because we've had this so many times in the body where there was a husband or a wife who was with us, usually a wife, who was not even concerned about her husband. Somewhere, if they couldn't dominate them, they weren't going to bear them at all, which is ridiculous. You don't dominate someone into salvation. Jesus didn't do that. Some who were like, oh, well, leaving him in the dust. I'm saved, though. How can you say you're submitted to your husband or your wife if you don't care about them? How can you claim that you've walked in the authority that God's given you correctly if your children are bleeding out at home and you're like, oh, thank God I'm saved? Verse 13, judge for yourselves. Is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? Does not the very nature of things teach you that if a man has long hair, it is a disgrace to him? But that if a woman has long hair, it's her glory. For long hair is given to her as a covering. For long hair is given to her as a covering. If anyone wants to be contentious about this, we have no other practice, nor do the churches of God. So very clear that Paul is addressing men should not have long hair. Women, if they have short hair, should grow it out again. Back to verse 10. because we need to discern this part about because of the angels. It is for this reason that a woman ought to have authority over her own head because of the angels. Since it starts out saying it is for this reason, we need to understand what was written before. A man ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and glory of God. Okay? A man ought not to have long hair, since he is the image and glory of God. But woman is the glory of man. For man did not come from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for woman, but woman for man. Remember what we're symbolizing here. The church was created for Christ, not the other way around. And yet, Christ serves his church. Christ died for his church. So we have to understand things through the perspective of God, not our own perspective. And there seems to be so much flesh that goes into interpreting this passage when we try to understand it on our own. Okay, let's reiterate. Man was not created for woman, but woman for man. Christ was not created for the church. Remember, Christ is the one who created you. Christ was not created for the church, but the church for Christ, the bride for Christ. It is for this reason that a woman ought to have authority over her own head. She ought to have discipline over her own head because of the angels. Okay, that just is like, blew my mind so many times trying to understand this passage. What in the world does that mean? And then it never says anything about the angels again. So I've been discerning this for a very long time now. Between last night and all day today, I've been praying about this and talking with God, and he's led me to a few things in order to understand this passage. First of all, I want to reiterate, what are the differences? The head directs, but not without the body. The head leads, but not without the body, or cannot exist without the body. We worship God only. We're not worshiping husbands, pastors, apostles. I don't care if your husband is the king of whatever. I don't care how much wisdom they have. Anything that they have comes from God. You don't worship your husband. Submission means that you care about the thoughts and feelings and testimony that is coming from the other person. And you submit yourself to sorting that through with them and considering with them and getting on the same page. You submit to one another, and when you submit to one another, you're operating as a whole. When you're not submitting to each other, you are disrespecting the union that God has established for you to become one flesh. Now, when you're submitting to Christ, you are rending your heart to everything, knowing that Christ is correct in all situations. But when you're submitting yourself to a human being, it's not the same, because Christ is both God and your husband. Your human husband is only your husband. He is not to be worshiped. And there is mention here of authority, her having authority over her own head, discipline over her own head. And as I mentioned to you earlier, authority denotes trust, role, and responsibility. First to God, then to man. And you have to be submitted to God first in order for you to know how to be submitted to man. Now we need to talk about the roles of angels. What is it that angels are doing? How, and we have to know that in order to know how do they factor into this whole thing. In Psalm 91:11 through 12, it says, "For he will command his angels concerning you to guard you in all your ways. They will lift you up in their hands so that you will not strike your foot against a stone." Okay, let's understand guard. You guys ever gone bowling? Like, I don't know if maybe you've gone bowling and seen or experienced when you were a kid that they put those guardrails up. And it's to keep you from going off the path so that you stay in the lane. That is the context of guarding you. They're not protecting you from experiencing anything, although they can. But in general, the role that we see angels having is that they are ministering angels. And even when they're seen fighting the battles, such as Michael, when he's fighting the battle, he's not doing this with a sword. Satan is fighting the battle in God's courts, and he's accusing the brethren day and night. What would Michael be doing? Well, in Job 33, it talks about someone who is dying physically and spiritually. And then it says in verse 23, yet if there is an angel at their side, a messenger, one out of 1,000, sent to tell them how to be upright. How do you fight the battle? Sent to tell them how to be upright. And he's gracious to that person and says to God, spare them from going down to the pit. I've found a ransom for them. Let their flesh be renewed like a child's. Let them be restored as in the days of their youth. Then that person can pray to God and find favor with him. They will see God's face and shout for joy. He will restore them to full well-being, and they'll go to others and say, I've sinned, I've perverted what is right, but I did not get what I deserved. God has delivered me from going down to the pit, and I shall live to enjoy the light of life. What's the implication regarding the role of angels? He will command his angels concerning you to guard you in all your ways. They will lift you up in their hands so that you will not strike your foot against a stone, so that you will not stumble, guys, so that you won't fall. He's keeping you. Remember that no one can take you out of his hands. Does this mean that we worship or venerate angels or put them on our, little images of them on our rearview mirror and, things like that? No, we do not do that. Because just as the angel said to John in Revelation, when John fell down to worship the angel, and the angel said, what? Don't do that. I am a fellow servant with you. Worship God alone. And remember that when talking about John the Baptist, Jesus said, of those born of women, it has been no one greater than John the Baptist, and yet he's least in the kingdom of heaven. So there are incredible angels who are ministering to us and helping us through, and yet we do not worship them. And remember that Jesus is referred to as having been made a little lower than the angels when he became flesh. Now, this psalm was cited in Luke 4:10 in reference to Jesus being tested. Remember, this was part of the way that the devil was trying to test him by telling him to throw himself off the cliff. Do it, because God says he'll command his angels concerning you to guard you in all your ways. And Jesus responded that you don't test God. But in Matthew 4:11, it says the devil left him and angels came and attended Jesus. These are the roles of angels. In this kingdom, we're all in submission to each other. Some have different authority, different roles. Even within this body, people have different roles. Does that make me better than you because I'm a witness? Paul said that every single role is vital. Even the less important roles are just as vital. They're needed. And so it seems what he's trying to move us away from is exaltation and veneration, but rather doing the roles for which we've been set apart correctly in God, walking in that authority correctly, and then desiring the greater gifts, as he says. So keep growing. If you've done well with a trust, God is going to give you more. We're all in submission to each other in this kingdom and in the body because we all need to be brought to unity. But there is a kind of submission, not worship, that we have to the angels of God and they to us as fellow servants. They minister to us and they keep us in his ways. So when it says that she must have authority or discipline over her own head, over herself, because of the angels, there's a reference to the role of these angels as messengers ministering to us. Now let's take this from the example of a wife submitting to a husband and move it to the role of the church submitting to Christ, the bride submitting to the husband of Christ, the head. Because we understand this situation a little bit more, and then we can understand the human example. Does the church submit to Christ? In their submission to Christ, do they just say, he's just going to do everything? Well, yes, actually, they do that in counterfeit Christianity. But those of us who know better, those of us who know the truth, know that we have a covenant and that he does his part and we do ours. If the church doesn't have authority over her own head, how can the angels minister to her? So I actually believe that the better translation here, which is also an option in terms of the original word that was used for because of the angels, is on account of. It is for this reason that a woman ought to have authority over her own head on account of the angels. That makes a little bit more sense, and it we're able to understand, okay, there's some reason why it is that she needs to have authority over her own head, so that the angels can minister to her, so that when they minister, they know who to minister to. Otherwise, if the husband is responsible for everything, if he's responsible for the covenant, why would they even minister to her? But she is to have authority. She is to have responsibility, discipline over her own head. If only counterfeit Christianity understood this, because what I see consistently is, again, that wives in general do not take responsibility for their covenant. They do not let their husbands know when they're doing wrong. They're idolatrous. They're not picking this up correctly. And surely they're not sitting in the counsel of God, or they would understand that that is incorrect. Surely they're not reading the entire scripture, because they would understand that that interpretation of worshiping your husband, setting your husband up as the idol through whom you somehow receive your salvation, is absolute idolatry. It is idolatry even in the sense of what counterfeit Christianity is doing right now with counterfeit Israel, where they've set up this image of the Antichrist that they worship, and they claim that they're the ones who are going to essentially experience the persecution of the Antichrist, and then they'll just be raptured up. How does any of that make sense? It's absolute wickedness to believe in any other covenant than has been laid out in the Word. Oh, so it's hard for the righteous to be saved, but thank God I have a righteous husband through whom I'm gonna be saved? I don't think so. That's idolatry. Let's read it again to make sure that we have a comprehensive understanding. It is for this reason that a woman ought to have authority over her own head on account of the angels. If she is taking responsibility, if she is disciplined, if she is maintaining her own authority over her own head, then the angels can minister to her. But if she's not, if she does not own her own covenant, if she is not disciplined, if she does not have authority over her own head, then the angels would need to go to someone else in order for that to happen, wouldn't they? But that's not the way God has set things up. Please discern this message with God.